The night was colder than it had any right to be. The wind howled through the trees like it had a score to settle, and the snow beneath my boots was so thick that every step felt like it could be my last. I wasn't supposed to be in this position. None of us were. But the war doesn't care about what you're supposed to do. It just cares about what you can pull off when everything seems stacked against you. We had been stuck in a position for weeks, frozen in place by a relentless enemy push and the brutal winter weather. The Allied forces had been fighting for control of a strategic town, and the Germans weren't about to let go without a fight. The artillery, small arms fire, it was endless. But the thing that really shook our resolve was the weather. The snow was blinding, the cold so fierce that even the tanks were starting to freeze up. You could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of something big happening. Everyone was on edge, waiting for the next move. And then came the order. "Get the tanks ready," they said. "We need to move out. We need to disappear." Disappearing in the snow wasn't as easy as it sounded. Our Shermans, while tough, were still large, loud, and unmistakable. When you've got tanks of that size rumbling through the snow, you leave a trail that's hard to miss. The idea of trying to move them under the cover of a blizzard was almost laughable. But in war, sometimes you don't get the luxury of a laugh. The higher-ups had their own plan to mask our movement. "Camouflage," they said. "Paint the tanks white." Simple enough, right? But getting the right paint, well, that's where things got interesting. We didn't have the right material. The military didn't supply it. And the standard white paint we had on hand didn't do the job, at least not in the thick of the storm. That's when I came up with an idea that would either get me court-martialed or hailed as a genius. I wasn't about to let a little thing like official supplies stop us. The Germans had supply depots all over the place, and I knew that if I could get to one of them, I could get us the paint we needed. It wasn't going to be easy. I'd have to cross enemy lines, sneak past their patrols, and steal enough paint to coat 15 tanks. But I didn't see any other choice. So I gathered a few men I could trust, those who could keep quiet, keep their heads down, and do what needed to be done. We moved out under the cover of night, the snow thick around us, our breaths freezing in the air. Every step felt like we were walking straight into the jaws of death, but none of us said a word. We were focused on the task ahead. We weren't just stealing paint, we were stealing the chance to survive. We reached the depot in the dead of night. The German soldiers were huddled inside, probably warming themselves by fires, thinking they were safe. But we were quiet, too quiet for them to hear us coming. We slipped inside the warehouse, grabbed the paint, 40 gallons of it, and loaded it onto our backs. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was more than enough to cover the tanks we needed to camouflage. I knew there was no time to waste. The Germans would notice we'd taken the paint soon enough, and when they did, they'd come after. We had to be fast. But as we were making our way back to the tanks, that's when everything almost went to hell. I stepped out from behind one of the sheds. There they were, 2 German soldiers standing in the middle of staring at us. They hadn't heard us. They were just looking in the wrong direction. My heart stopped split second. This was it. If they spotted us now, we were done for. But I wasn't about to go down I held my breath, watching the men. They didn't seem to see us. I motioned for the others to stay still, not a word passing between us. I waited for what felt like eternity before the soldiers turned and walked off in the other direction. It was like the entire world exhaled when they were out of sight. But I knew we couldn't wait around. We had to move fast. The snow was deep, and the night was drawing to a close. Every second counted. With 40 gallons of enemy paint on our backs, we made our way back to the Shermans, keeping to the shadows and moving as quietly as we could. When we got there, we wasted no time. The tanks had to be completely covered before first light, and we couldn't afford to mess up. We painted them white, layer by layer, in the bitter cold, each stroke of the brush feeling like it might be our last. But when it was done, when we'd finished the last of the tanks, it was like something from a dream. The Shermans blended perfectly into the snow. They were invisible. The next morning, when the first light of dawn broke through the heavy clouds, I couldn't help but marvel at the sight in front of me. 15 Sherman, perfectly camouflaged, now stood quietly in the snow, blending in so seamlessly with the surroundings they almost seemed to be a part of them. The white paint we had stolen wasn't just any paint. It was something different, something that, under the right conditions, could make an entire tank disappear into the snow like a ghost. I couldn't help but feel a small grin tug at the corners of my mouth. We'd done it. We had stolen the paint, painted the tanks, and now they were practically invisible. But that's when the reality of what we had done began to settle in. We had just pulled off a heist right under the noses of the enemy. And not just any heist. This was the kind of stunt that could make or break an entire campaign. If we got caught, there was no coming back from it. If the Germans found out we had stolen their paint, there would be no escaping the consequence. But in that moment, I didn't care. We had a chance, a real chance to move undetected, and that was all that mattered. The squadron was getting ready to move out. We were preparing for the offensive, and our mission was clear. Sneak past the German defenses, infiltrate their position, and strike when they least expected it. They had fortified everything, every ridge, every outpost, so getting close was going to be a nightmare. But now, with the tanks hidden in plain sight, we had a fighting chance. We moved out in the early hours of the morning, the snow still falling heavily, blanketing the world in a thick, suffocating silence. It was perfect. We could move slowly, carefully, without making us. The Germans had no idea we were right under their noses, and as long as we stuck to the plan, we would be able to slip through their lines undetected. The wind howled around us, but we kept moving, the sound of our treads muffled by the snow. There was an eerie calmness to it all, like we were ghosts moving through the mist. We came up on the first enemy position by midday. The Germans had set up a perimeter near a ridge, with a few light tanks, some infantry patrolling the area. They had no idea what was about to happen. We had been moving slowly, carefully, letting the weather do the work for us. And when we finally crested the hill, I gave the order to halt. The tanks were perfectly still, their white coats blending into the landscape, indistinguishable from snow-covered terrain. From a distance, they looked like nothing more than patches of snow, and it was perfect cover. I ordered the crew to hold position and wait. We had to be patient. The Germans would patrol the area again soon, and we needed to time our attack perfectly. It was like hunting, and we were the predator. We didn't make sound. We didn't move. We waited. The Germans did exactly what we expected. They sent out a small patrol, unaware that we were lying in wait. They came within range, close enough that we could almost hear their footsteps in the snow. I could see the silhouettes of their tanks in the distance, moving slowly across, their engines rumbling faintly. They were too focused on the surrounding, too distracted, blizzard in the quiet, to notice it. They had no reason to believe something so out of place, so completely hidden, right under their noses. The first shot rang out. It was a clean hit. The enemy tank, the closest one to us, exploded in a fiery burst, the shell ripping through the hull like it was paper. The shock of the blast was deafening, but it didn't matter. We were already moving. I gave the order to advance, and within seconds we were tearing through their lines, our Shermans charging forward like wolves among sheep. The Germans scrambled. It was chaos. Their soldiers panicked, trying to return fire. The confusion was overwhelming. They had no idea where we were coming from, no idea how we had got close. They couldn't even see us, our tanks, so perfectly camouflaged, blended into the snow like they were part of the storm itself. Another tank went up in flames, another explosion, and then another. We kept moving, each shot landing with terrifying accuracy, each tank crumbling under the onslaught. The battle was short, devastating. The enemy didn't know what hit them. We made it through the ridge and into their fortification, knocking out their artillery, taking out their defensive positions one by one. The Germans tried to fight back, but they were too late. They couldn't adjust fast enough. Our surprise had thrown them off balance, and by the time they figured out where we were, it was already over. The battle was ours. When it was finally done, the snow around us was littered with the wreckage of enemy tanks and the bodies of soldiers. I took a moment to the weight of it all settle in. We had done the impossible. We had moved without being seen, struck when they least expected it on top, and all because of one simple thing, the paint. I couldn't help but smile as I surveyed the battlefield. The snow fell softly. The tanks, our tanks, stood tall among the carnage, still hidden in plain sight, still a symbol of everything we had achieved. It wasn't just about camouflage. It wasn't just about the paint. It was about what we had done with the odds stacked against us. We had moved through their lines without them even knowing we were there. And in that moment, I realized how much small victory meant. The rest of the world would never know about paint, the stealth, the risk we took to make sure we had a fighting chance. But to us, that mission would always stand as a reminder. Sometimes it's the smallest, most unexpected things that make the biggest difference. And when you've got a little bit of luck and a lot of guts, you can make the impossible happen. The days that followed felt like a blur. We had won, and the victory was significant. But that wasn't the end of it. In war, there's never a moment to rest on your laurel. We had taken the enemy by surprise, and it had been beautiful, a flawless execution. But every victory carries with it the potential for greater repercussion. The Germans would soon figure out how we'd managed to infiltrate their lines so cleanly. They did. They'd come for us. There was no escaping that. We had crossed a line. As I stood next to the beast, still camouflaged, snowy shroud, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The same feeling I had when we made the initial strike. The one that told me we were right on the edge of something bigger than us. I couldn't, not when the next move was already being calculated in the minds of those in down. The other crews, the soldiers in the field, were high on adrenaline, feeling like invincible ghosts. They had witnessed firsthand what the beast and the rest of us could do when the odds were stacked against. But in the back of my mind, I kept seeing the German supply depots, the paint. I knew it wouldn't be long before someone came looking for the stolen goods. They wouldn't let this one slide. I gathered my crew for a quick briefing, making sure everyone was on high alert. The tanks, still hidden beneath their white coats, were ready to roll at a moment's notice. But the risk of being caught with stolen supplies hung over us like a cloud. We couldn't let our guard down. We need to keep moving, I told them. The Germans won't let this go. They'll want to retaliate, and they'll want us to know they're coming for us. They nodded, their expression serious. They knew exactly what I meant. In this war, there was no room for mistake, no room for hesitation. One wrong move, and we could lose everything. But there was something in the air, something about the way the snowflakes swirled around us that made me feel like we were always one step ahead. It wasn't about the tank, the paint, and it was survival, and we were good at that. As the days passed, the tension continued to mount. Our reconnaissance reported unusual German movement, strange troop alignment, and the unmistakable signs that they were aware of attack. It was only a matter of time before the retaliation came, but in the meantime, we moved quickly, using the cover of the snowstorm to make our next move. Quietly, swiftly, and without attracting attention. One night, as we lay low in a small makeshift camp, I received a message from headquarters. They had caught wind of what had happened, the stolen paint, camouflage trick, and the higher-ups were both impressed and nervous. They understood the tactical advantage we had gained, but they were equally worried about potential fallout. If the Germans figured out where the paint had gone, they'd come for us with everything they had. The message was clear. Stay low, keep moving, and above all, avoid detection. But the real challenge ahead. We had already made a name for ourselves, and with that came the expectation that we would continue to deliver results. The pressure was mounting. The men trusted me, but I could feel the weight of their expectations bearing down on me. We had done the impossible once. Could we do it again? The German counteroffensive began with full force. Their artillery thundered in the distance. Their tanks rolled forward with precision. The storm had cleared, but the battlefield remained treacherous. We had no choice but to engage. There was no way to retreat. The Shermans, with their white camouflage, still blended perfectly into the snow, but the enemy had adjusted their tactic, bringing in heavier firepower, moving their forces strategically. We found ourselves at the center of a brutal confrontation, with the Beast and the rest of the tanks carrying the weight of the mission on their armored back. The Germans had adapted, but they couldn't see us coming. Our tanks moved like shadows, striking with deadly precision, picking off their lines one by one. We had the advantage of surprise again, and we used it to its fullest. But this time, the enemy wasn't unprepared. They had learned from their mistakes and started countering our movements with greater efficiency. Our forces were taking hits. The ground shook with the explosions, and I could feel the strain on the tanks pushed forward. The fight became a battle of attrition. Who would last longer? Who would bend first? I could feel the tension in my gut. This wasn't like before. The snow no longer felt like a blanket of protection. It felt like a shroud hiding us from the enemy, but also suffocating us. I kept pushing the men, urging them to stay focused, to keep moving forward. But as the hours passed, the lines between us and the Germans began to blur. The battle was no longer about stealing paint or getting the drop on the enemy. It was about survival, plain and simple. I caught sight of a German officer standing in the distance, directing troops and shouting orders. He wasn't looking our way, but I knew that would change soon. It was then that I made a decision. We weren't just going to fight to survive. We were going to give them something they wouldn't forget. We were going to make them regret ever thinking they could outmaneuver us. I ordered a full advance. We would hit them with everything we had. The Shermans, still covered in the stolen paint, moved forward, charging across the battlefield, their engines roaring like a choir of vengeance. We struck with fury, pushing the Germans back and turning the tide in our favor. The battle raged for hours, but when it was finally over, when the last of the enemy tanks had been neutralized, I stood there, breathing heavily, looking at the wreckage. The snow was stained red. The silence was deafening. But in that silence, there was a sense of victory, a hard-earned victory. We had made it through the impossible again, and this time we had proven something even greater than before. We had proven, no matter how much the odds were stacked against, no matter what we had to sacrifice, we could still win, and we would keep fighting, because that's what we were made to do. As I surveyed the battlefield, I couldn't help but smile. We had done it again. The Beast had done it again, and I knew, deep down, that the legend of what we had pulled off with those 40 gallons of paint would live on long after the war ended. The days following the counteroffensive felt like an eternity. The battlefield was littered with the remnants of brutal fight, burnt tank, frozen soldiers, and the deep marks of artillery that scarred the land. But it wasn't just the physical destruction that weighed heavily on us. It was the lingering knowledge that while we'd won the battle, we were still far from safe. The Germans were relentless, and their resolve had only strengthened after our surprise attack. They wouldn't let this one slide. They would retaliate, and when they did, we had to be ready. Every night, as we huddled around our makeshift campfires, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. The snow, which had once offered us cover, now felt like an open grave. We were exposed, waiting for the next wave to come. But even with that weight pressing down on us, we kept going. We didn't have a choice. The Beast and the other tanks were our greatest asset. But they had taken a beating. The stolen paint had done its job. Our tanks had moved undetected for a time, and they had struck fear into the enemy. But now, with the counterattack in full swing, those same tanks were starting to show the wear and tear of prolonged battle. Every scratch, every dent, reminded me of how close we had come to losing it all. But somehow, the beast had always come through for us. It wasn't just the machine anymore. It was something we believed in, something we had put our faith in when the world seemed too dark to see. One morning, as we prepared for another push, word came down from command. The Germans had launched a full-scale counter. Their forces were concentrated, stronger than ever, and they were coming for us with everything they had. This was no longer a skirmish. This was the kind of battle that could shift the tide of the entire campaign. If we didn't hold our ground, if we didn't fight back with everything we had left, we could lose everything, and there was no one else to help us. We were on our own. The pressure was suffocating. But as I looked over the beast and the crew, I knew one thing. We had through worse, and we had come out the other side. We had faced the impossible before. Now was no different. We moved out just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the world turning a ghostly shade of gray. The air was cold, biting our faces, and the wind carried the sound of distant artillery. The ground beneath us was frozen solid, making every movement feel like we were trudging through a swamp. But we didn't stop. We couldn't afford to. The German artillery started firing, the blast shaking the ground beneath us. We moved swiftly, hugging the shadows, taking advantage of the dark and the snowstorm that had picked up once again. It was like déjà vu. But this time, we weren't just hiding to get the drop on them. This time, we were preparing to make a final stand. The odds were worse than ever, but we weren't about to let the Germans walk over it. The first encounter came swiftly. A small German convoy appeared ahead of us, moving along a ridge. We could see them clearly. Our tanks were still hidden, camouflaged in the snow, but their tanks were exposed, vulnerable in the open. It was a perfect. I motioned for the crew to get into position. The beast rumbled under me, ready for action. My heart was racing, but I knew I had to stay calm. This was our moment. If we could neutralize this convoy, it would be a victory. We could break through and make our way to the enemy's core, hit them hard before they had a chance to regroup. I signaled the attack. The roar of the beast's engine filled the silence of the night as we advanced, moving faster than we had any right to. The German tanks were caught off guard, unable to react before we took them out one by one. The first tank exploded in a burst of flame. The second was knocked out almost immediately, and the third, well, we made quick work of that one too. The convoy was decimated in moments. The snow around us turned a crimson red as the tanks burned, but as the last of the German tanks went up in smoke, I realized we were running out of time. The attack had been swift, but it wouldn't go unnoticed. We had to keep moving, keep striking while the Germans were still reeling from the surprise. But we couldn't do it alone. The crew was already, their energy spent from constant push. And the beast? It was showing signs of wear. The treads were beginning to slip. The engine was running hot, groaning under the strain. It was like the machine was telling us it had reached its limit. I felt the weight of the decision heavy on my chest. Do we push forward and risk it all? We pull back, wait for reinforcements, and hope for best? The answer was simple, and it came from somewhere deep inside me. There was no turning back, not when we were this close, not when we had already come so far. I gave the order to press forward. We would fight until there was no fight left in us. As we pushed deeper into enemy territory, we encountered more resistance. The Germans had regrouped, and their tanks were coming at us with renewed. Became a blur. Gunfire, explosion, constant rumble of engine, and the cries caught in. We fought through it, but I could feel the fatigue in my bones, in my hands, trembled with every turn of the wheel. I had to keep the crew focused, had to keep them in line. But as the hours passed, it became clear that we couldn't hold out forever. The beast was still moving, but it wasn't as quick. It wasn't as agile. And that's when I saw a German tank positioned on a ridge, aimed right at us. We didn't have time to dodge. It fired, the round screaming through the air toward us. The explosion rocked the tank, sending a shock wave through the entire vehicle. The blast shook the crew, and for a moment, everything went silent. But we weren't done yet. We couldn't be. I ordered the crew to fire back, and the beast, despite the damage, responded with everything it had left. The moment the shell hit, time seemed to freeze. The explosion had sent the shock wave through the beast, rattling every bolt, every piece of metal. It was the kind of impact that made you question if you could keep going. The crew was dazed, shaken, their faces pale as they tried to gather themselves. But I wasn't about to let this be the end. Not after everything we'd been through. Not after everything we had. I gripped the controls, feeling the engine shudder beneath me. I could hear the groan of the tank's armor, the whine of a hydraulic system struggling to maintain pressure. The blast had done some real damage. One of the treads was half missing. The turret was sluggish, unable to turn as quickly as it should. But the beast wasn't done yet, and neither were we. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" I shouted over the intercom, my voice rough from exhaustion and adrenaline. "We're not done, not yet." The crew barely responded, their hands fumbling to get back to their stations. But they moved, slowly at first, then with more urgency. Seconds ticked by. Every moment felt like it could be our last. Every corner of the battlefield holding a new danger. The enemy had regrouped, and they were closing in on us, tank after tank, infantry pushing forward with a vengeance. The Germans weren't about to let us off easy. They had learned from their mistakes, and now they were determined to crush us. I could see the enemy tanks moving into position, their cannons trained on us. But that's when it happened. The second wave of artillery. The German tanks coming in from the flanks. Our position was about to be overrun. We had no choice but to push forward, to try and take the fight to them before they could surround us. I ordered the crew to load up with everything we had, ammunition, smoke screens, anything that could give us the upper hand. But as the first rounds fired from the beast, I realized something. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting to leave our mark, to prove that we were more than just a bunch of men in stolen tanks. We were a force that couldn't be ignored. The next few moments were chaos. I could hear the whistling of enemy shells, the roar of their tanks as they moved in on us. It was like every sound was amplified, the battlefield a cacophony of violence and destruction. But through it all, we held our ground. We fired back, shot after shot, hitting enemy tanks' precision. It wasn't easy. The damage to the beast was mounting, and we were losing speed, losing our advantage. But the crew was focused. They were determined, and I could feel the power of the machine beneath me, pushing through the hell of it all. Then we saw the last line of defense, a group of German tanks, heavier than anything we had encountered before, making their way toward us. This was another skirmish. This was the final stand. They were coming at us with everything they had, and if we didn't act fast, it would be over. I made the call. We weren't running anymore. We weren't hiding. We were going to hit them head on, take the fight to their front lines, and show them that we weren't backing down. "Prepare for impact," I yelled. The crew braced as we locked in on the first German tank, its massive silhouette coming closer. I could see the guns turning, could feel the tension in the air. But we were closer. I ordered the first round, and we fired. The shot hit home, and the explosion rocked us. The German tank crumpled, smoke billowing from its wreckage. They didn't back off. More were coming, and they were angrier now. We fired again and again, the beast responding with every ounce of power it had left. Wasn't enough. Their tanks were too strong, their numbers too great. We were outgunned. It was clear we couldn't fight this out. We needed to get out of here now. Snow only chance. We had to disappear again, use the same tactics that had worked before. But this time, the Germans wouldn't be as easy to fool. I ordered the crew to retreat, but as we started to pull back, one of the German tanks took its shot. The blast hit the side of the beast, and I felt the whole tank shudder under the force. The crew scrambled to regain control, but we were losing power fast. The turret was jammed, the engine sputtering. It wasn't just the beast that was falling apart now, it was us too. But then something clicked. I couldn't just abandon everything we'd worked for. We couldn't just let the enemy have the satisfaction of knowing they'd beaten us. I turned to my crew. "We're not giving up yet. Get ready." The crew, looking beaten but resolute, nodded. We still had a chance. There was still a way out. With what was left of the beast's power, I pushed forward again, using the last of our speed to get us into the thick of the snow. The German tanks fired, but the distance, the snow, and our damaged tank helped conceal us. We were disappearing once again into the snow. Just like the roar of the German tanks grew fainter as we pushed deeper into the snow, and after a few heart-stopping minutes, we found ourselves hidden, barely visible against the white. The Germans didn't know where we had gone. They didn't know we were still there, still fighting, still breathing. We had made it again. We lay there, hidden in the snow. The German tanks rumbled, unaware of the chaos that had unfolded. The cold bit into my bones, but in that moment, it felt almost like relief. We had made it. We had survived. And for now was all that mattered. But it wasn't over. The war never ends until it's. And there was still the question of what came next. The beast was barely running now, its engine sputtering, the turret stuck in place. It had taken everything we had left to make it through that fight. And now I wasn't sure it could keep going much longer. I looked around at the crew. They were exhausted, their faces worn from days of battle, from the cold, from the fear that had been gnawing at all of us. But they were alive, was I. That was something to hold on to. We waited there for hours in silence, listening to the snow falling around us. The sound strange, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. We knew the Germans would regroup, come back stronger or safe, buried under layers of snow, invisible to their eye. Eventually, we made the decision to move. We had no choice. If we stayed where we were, the Germans would find us eventually, and the beast wouldn't be able to take another hit. We had to keep moving, keep fighting, keep going until we couldn't anymore. I ordered the crew to make repairs, to try to get the beast running again. They worked quickly, doing what they could with what little we had left. It took hours, but we managed to get the tank moving again, slowly, creaking and groaning under the strain. The turret still wouldn't move, but it didn't matter. We weren't planning on engaging in another firefight. For now, we just needed to get out of there. As we drove through the snow, the landscape around us looked like a ghost town, empty, still, covered in a blanket of white. It was hard to believe there had been such chaos only hours ago. The snow had once offered us cover, now felt like a tomb, hiding the death and destruction beneath its surface. We moved cautiously, always watching, listening to the sound of enemy engine for any sign that the Germans were closing in. The night seemed to drag on forever, and every mile we covered felt like it could be our last. But the snow, the camouflage, it kept us hidden. By morning, we had reached a small village, one that had been abandoned during the fighting. It was the first real shelter we had seen in days. We moved through the village cautious, knowing it wouldn't be long before the Germans came looking for us. We didn't have much time. The damage to the beast was worse than I had originally thought. The engine was overheating, and we were running low on supply. The crew was exhausted, but we didn't have the luxury of rest. We had to keep moving. That's when the orders came down from headquarters. A counter-offensive was planned. They were sending reinforcements, but we couldn't wait for them. We had to hold our position no matter what. The Germans were preparing their own assault, and if we didn't act fast, we would be overrun. It was the kind of decision that no one wanted to make. But I knew it had to be done. If we didn't hold our ground, if we didn't stop the Germans now, everything we had fought for would be lost. I gathered the crew together, explained the situation, and told them what had to be done. There was no hesitation in their eyes. They knew what we had to do. We set up defenses, using what little cover we had left. The tanks, the Beast included, were positioned on the outskirts of the village, ready to hold off the enemy. We knew they would come. When they did, we would be waiting. But I also knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and our tanks were barely operational. The first German assault came just before nightfall. The sound of their tanks, their engines roaring in the distance, sent a chill down my spine. They were coming for it with everything they had, and we were going to meet them head on. The night exploded into chaos. The first few rounds hit the Beast hard, shaking it to its core. The turret still wouldn't move, but I didn't need it to. We fired with everything we had, using the firepower of the remaining tanks to push the Germans back. The crew worked quickly, reloading, firing, staying focused. The cold was unbearable, but we didn't stop. I could hear the cries of battle all around me, the sound of explosions, the rumble of tanks as they collided in the night. The snow was stained red, the ground trembling beneath us, but we kept pushing forward, each shot landing with deadly precision. The Beast, shadow among shadows, hidden in plain sight, firing at will, tearing into the enemy lines. By dawn, the Germans had retreated. The village had been saved, but the Beast was heavily damaged. We had taken out enough enemy tanks to slow their progress, but we had lost men. Men I had known, men I had beside. It was a victory, yes, but it felt hollow. The battle wasn't over. The war wasn't over. As I stood there looking over the wreckage, I realized something. We had survived again, but the war had changed us. It had taken so much from us, our homes, our lives, our innocence, but it hadn't taken our will to fight. And as long as we were still breathing, we would keep pushing forward, even when everything seemed impossible. Because in the end, it wasn't about the tank. It wasn't about the stolen paint. It wasn't about the battles won or lost. It was about surviving long enough to fight the next fight. And the Beast, in all its glory and madness, had taught me that sometimes that was enough. As the war wound down, the constant tension that had hung over us for so long began to dissipate, like the final moments of a storm. The enemy had retreated. The fronts were shifting, and the heavy artillery finally fell silent. But the damage, the scars left on the land, on the people, and on us, was permanent. For those of us who had been on the front lines, the end of the war didn't bring the kind of peace we had expected. Instead, it felt like a strange, hollow silence, like we were still waiting for the next explosion, the next command, the next fight. When the Beast was finally retired and sent off to be preserved in a museum, I stood in front of it, a little surprised at how small it looked in the daylight. The snow, which had once offered us cover, was now just a backdrop to the tank's battle-worn frame, its white camouflage faded and chipped. People walked around it, looking at it as if it were just another relic, another piece of history. But to me, it was more than that. It was the culmination of everything we had fought for. It was a symbol of survival, of ingenuity, and of pushing through the impossible. I had built it, and in a way, it had built me. As I stood there, a sense of pride mixed with something heavier. The Beast had become a legend, one that I hadn't asked for, but one that had changed the course of everything. I had gone from being a mechanic, fixing tanks behind the scenes, to being part of a story that would be remembered for decades. And yet, the recognition wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the men who had fought alongside the Beast, the crew who had believed in it when no one else did. They were the true heroes. But time has a funny way of turning memories into shadows. After the war, I returned home to a world that had moved on without me. People talked about the victory, about the war ending, but I was no longer the same man who had left. The world around me was quieter, and it felt as if the echoes of the battlefield were still ringing in my ears. I tried to go back to normal life, worked on civilian machines, did what I knew best, but there was always something missing. The roar of the beast's engine, the camaraderie of the crew, the unspoken bond we shared as we fought our way through the snow. Those were the things that had kept me alive. And when I was alone, late at night, I could still hear it. The hum of the tank's engine, the cold biting at my skin, the silence of a battlefield stretching out before us. The phone calls started coming in, and the letters too. A few from old comrades checking in, asking how I was doing, how I was holding up. I'd always tell them I was fine, that I was adjusting. Deep down, I knew I wasn't. I had left pieces of myself in snow, the beast, and in every battle that we had fought. And as much as I tried to fit back into a world that felt foreign, I knew I would never be the same again. I don't think you ever truly leave the war behind. It stays with you even after the final battle is won. The faces of the men you lost, the ones you saved, the ones who had believed in you when you had no faith in yourself, they become part of you. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see them, all of them, standing beside me, watching over me, even though they're gone. It's a strange feeling, being haunted by the ones you fought beside. At the same time, I know they're with me in some way. In the years that followed, I heard stories about the beast, about how it had become an icon, a symbol of ingenuity and resilience. People came to see it, to touch it, to imagine what it had been like to sit inside it, to fire its guns, to be part of the legend. But it wasn't just the tank that was legendary. It was the men who had made it work. It was the crew who had worked together, each of us doing what we could to keep the wheels turning, the engines roaring, and the mission going. We had been more than just soldiers. We had been a family, and though the war was over and the world had moved on, I couldn't help but think that the real victory wasn't in the battles won or the medals earned. The real victory was in the things we had learned along the way, in the strength we found in each other, in the machines we had brought to life, and in the belief that even when everything seemed lost, we could still come through on the other side. I guess that's what people mean when they talk about surviving. It's not just about living through the war. It's about learning how to keep going when the world around you falls apart. And when the war ended, that's what we did. We kept going, because that's what the beast taught us, and that's what I would never forget. The last time I saw the beast, it was sitting quietly in the museum, a relic of a time that was gone but not forgotten. I walked up to it, running my hand over the cold metal, remembering the roar of its engine, the feel of its controls, the sweat and blood we had spilled together. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was part of me, part of all of us. And in that moment, I knew that the story of the beast would live on, not just in the museum, not book, but in the men who had fought, in the men who had stolen paint, who had broken the odds, and who had learned that sometimes the only thing that matters is making sure you never stop fighting.